Nā mihi ki te mana whenua o tēnei wahi. Nā mihi ki te manuhiri, nā mihi ki te manuhiri tuarangi, nā mihi ki nā rangatira, and nā mihi ki te nā kaimahi. My name is Guy Penny. I'm a geographer and a scientist from Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. Given that you've already talked about me, I'll skip that bit. But lately, last year or so, I've been working, or last couple of years, with the University of Otago's Public Housing and Urban Regeneration Research Program as the lead of the Māori strand within that program, which is why I'm here today, to present to you some of the work that the Māori strand has been doing within that research program, and to present our model of Māori wellbeing, which we've labelled the whakawhanaungatanga Māori wellbeing model. So this presentation comes from a paper that has been submitted to the New Zealand Journal of Social Science. It's currently under review, and so there's a lot more detail in that paper than I can present here today. But the idea behind our model, which was developed specifically for the research program, although it can be used much more widely, the idea behind it is this notion of whakawhanaungatanga. So the sort of the process of establishing and building relationships and connections, because that process and relationships are a fundamental mechanism through which Māori wellbeing can be achieved. So I just left the pointer over there. And as I say, this model was designed specifically for the Public Housing and Urban Regeneration Program, but can obviously be used more widely. So in terms of our research setting, the proposition that sits behind the research program is that the public housing providers have a role to enable and support well-being of their tenants. And obviously within public housing, there's something like 35 to 40% of tenants are Māori. So there is public housing providers have a role to support and enable the well-being of their Māori tenants. And as I say, this was developed for the Public Housing and Urban Regeneration Program, which has something like 40 researchers working on it. It's a very large, it's an Endeavour-funded project through MB, and it has 7 research strands. So these are basically themes, if you like, or working groups, which we've labelled strands. And there's a governance strand, community housing, urban formation strand, a housing quality strand, an energy strand, a transport strand, a sort of mainstream wellbeing strand, and of course there's a Māori strand. And our role is the Māori strand. There are 5 of us in the Māori team, if you like, all with experience either in providing health services or in health research. So there's quite a depth of experience, some academics, some working in the sector in the front line delivering services. So our strand is a mix. So one of the objectives of our strand was to develop a model of well-being, Māori well-being, that can be used by all the other strands. So the idea is that given the breadth and depth of the research, we wanted to develop something that was consistent across, that could be used by our research colleagues in all the other strands. So that they didn't have to spend time developing sort of a baseline or an idea of what Māori wellbeing is, and that we would do that work for them. So our job is to create this wellbeing model, or it might actually be better to think of it as a framework or even a guide or a map. I know people kind of glaze over when you say the word framework. People are probably sick to death of that word, but really it is it's a way of approaching Māori wellbeing that we want to apply consistently across the program. And the other thing to mention is that the research is working with 7, I guess, public housing providers across the Motu, the Tamaki Transformation Project, Eastern Porirua Transformation Project, Salvation Army, there's Ōtautahi Housing Trust, there's the Wellington City Council, and also the Wainuiomata Marae Trust. So, given the complexity of the research here, we wanted to create this consistent model, and that's what I'm presenting here to you today. And to do that, we basically did a literature review in order to answer these 2 questions. What is Māori wellbeing? And once you've established that, how do we apply that to the research? What does this mean for housing and urban research? But also it's relevant for development, if you want to use our model for that. So just at a very broad level, some of the findings, I guess, is that well-being is multidimensional and dynamic. It has many elements to it. It is therefore very complex. And I guess that's why we're getting so many problems with the delivery of housing that meets everyone's needs, because it's probably coming from only a few perspectives. Wellbeing is also the outcome of many factors, the interactions between many of those factors. And so it's sort of context specific or culture specific, and it's also, I guess, person specific. This is what the literature is telling us. There are also many different perspectives on well-being, and the way you might measure or assess well-being. There are many different ways to look at that as well. But one of the points that the literature is telling us is that when you're trying to evaluate or improve well-being, you really need to take a holistic approach. Okay, I mean, it's pretty obvious these days, I think. The other important point to note is that our well-being is influenced both by our physical environment, so the structures that we live in and the communities we live in, the physical aspects of that, but it's also influenced greatly by the social or cultural context. And so again, the literature calls that environmental determinism, and it's this concept that physical spaces and structures have the capacity to transform us, either in a positive way or a negative way. And the other term they use is social constructivism, which is this idea that knowledge and reality is created by society. And we've heard a bit about that earlier today. It's also contested by society and challenged all the time. But really the idea is that whoever's creating the narrative is also defining well-being often, and therefore how you achieve well-being is really connected to how you're defining well-being. So, I mean, social media is probably a place that we can think of where the physical environment is not so important, but really these forums and these spaces, they have rules, and there's what's moral, what's ethical, who can be involved, who can be excluded. That's what we're talking about when we say well-being is affected by or influenced greatly by the social construction of the spaces that we inhabit. And just as a sort of a little point to sort of represent what I'm talking about, the built environment. So whoever's in control of the built environment is building all these things, housing, neighbourhoods and landscapes, infrastructure. They're in cities and towns and so forth. And the way they influence our well-being is through this kind of lens there in the middle. through these pathways, through the physical environment, the physical spaces, and also through the social narrative, if you like, the labels we put on things. And that's affecting the well-being of individuals, of whānau. On this side here, the well-being can be at any scale. It can be, as I say, the well-being of a community, or as we've just heard, the well-being of women, or the well-being of men, or the well-being of communities. So whoever's creating this built environment, they've got their own definition of well-being, which might be very, very narrow, just really around warm and dry, for example, which I'm not saying it's not important, it's very important, but that might be meeting our physical needs. But on the other side, we have all these other elements of well-being that might not be catered for through the built environment. And so what we're trying to really look at is more of a two-way conversation. So whatever group you might belong to, you know, let's see if we can get some pushback towards designing communities and houses that really do cater for the well-being of all those people there. And I guess it's one of the roles that we have as researchers is, and it was mentioned before, getting the voices of the people who are really the ones who are being affected by these decisions, getting those voices fed back to the policymakers and so forth, and developers, and the council rules and all that sort of thing. This slide here is really just to make a couple of points about Te Ao Māori, which I'm sure you're all aware of, but as researchers, and really, I guess as developers and public housing providers, you really want to understand some of these basic things about the Māori world. And I don't mean they're basic in themselves, but this should all be common knowledge to us all now. And that is that, I say traditional in brackets there, so I'm talking about pre-colonisation and even post Māori culture and institutions. They developed around the concepts of belonging, health and innovation. So these aren't new to us. We just haven't been given the chance really to express them as fully as we'd like to. Also, all things are interrelated and connected through whakapapa. So it's a really important concept that I'll speak about a bit more later. And also that Māori are part of the natural world, and just as they are part of communities and society, they need to express and demonstrate these connections in different ways. Māori identity is intrinsically linked to the land, as we know, and the natural environment, and cultural institutions and social status. And of course, Māori health and well-being has multiple dimensions that we know about already, and that the well-being of Māori, of the individual, is really coupled to the well-being of the collective. And of course, the well-being of Māori is dependent on participation in and control of decisions that affect Māori. Hence the Tino Rangatira flag there, which is really representing, these are things that are kind of authentic to Māori. So it's important for us as scientists to understand that setting, but it's also important for policymakers and social housing providers to know this so they can change what they're doing if they have an interest in meeting the wellbeing needs of their tenants. Okay, so our literature review, from our literature review, I should say, we sort of identified 7 whakaaro or concepts that form and inform our model, our whakawhanaungatanga Māori wellbeing model. And the first of those is that relationships are a primary determinant of Māori wellbeing. And so this comes from the idea that we have that we all sit within an ecosystem of relationships, each one of us. But particularly for Māori, we see that as crossing space and time and binding all things together in the universe, our gods, our whenua, plants, animals. So this really informs our worldview as Māori. Connections are important, and this idea of a collective, okay, working together. So, if you have this mindset that you're part of this ecosystem, it immediately means you're part of a collective in some way. And so you need to manage those relationships. The literature says that relationships underpin an individual's sense of purpose, belonging, identity, and social and legal rights and responsibilities, all of which influence well-being in different ways. The other thing about relationships for Māori is that we don't only have them with living people. We have relationships with our tūpuna who have passed on, whānau members who have passed on, and we also have relationships with te taiao, our awa and our maunga and our whenua and our moana and our ngāhere and so forth. So that's an important aspect of this idea of whakawhanaungatanga. We don't just establish relationships with people, we establish them with our environment. The next point is this notion of wairuatanga or spirituality, and that's come through very strongly in the literature, is that wairuatanga is almost the key foundation of Māori well-being. So in traditional Māori society, relationships were primarily framed by wairuatanga, sort of spiritual practices that acknowledge connections between past, present and future events, as well as relationships with our tūpuna and the natural world and our atua. Mason Drury, who developed Whare Tapawhā back in 1985, he included, he showed that spirituality was an essential component of Māori health alongside, tinana, our physical well-being, our hingingaro, our mental well-being, our manawa or emotional well-being, and of course the well-being of our communities and whānau. And all people have these aspects to them. So spirituality, according to Mason Drury, without a spiritual awareness, the individual is considered to be lacking in well-being and more prone to disability and misfortune. So the next point is that the literature says quite strongly that we must have a focus on whānau, and that particularly for Māori housing, the focus should be on whānau aspirations, whānau priorities and whānau participation in the whole housing process. And also for us, for Māori, obvious connection, whānau is across multiple generations as well. Okay, so we want to enable those connections. The other point is that we want to have a focus on Kāinga rather than whare per se, because the Kāinga is situated in relation to other whare. I guess the notion of Kāinga means that the whare should be afforded respect as having its own mauri, so it needs to be respected. A whare speaks to the environment, and so really, and I'm not saying this isn't happening, this is definitely happening, there is much more of a focus on Kāinga rather than just the house itself, if you like. The next point is that we draw attention to this idea or the critical role of tikanga in well-being, and I've got a definition of tikanga here, but I think you probably all know what that means. the thing about tikanga is that it not only articulates and reinforces our values, our connection and identity. Tikanga are used to maintain balance between the different forces present in relationships. Now that might sound a bit abstract, but I'll sort of demonstrate a bit later if you like. And tikanga helps us steer our relationships towards healthy outcomes. And of course, tikanga values underpin our tikanga, and tikanga are related to particular places, so they are adaptable and they're different in different situations in different locations. Sort of the notion of balance and harmony is related to this, and balance is a key feature of Te Ao Māori, and it's evident in almost all the sort of Māori wellbeing models that we had a look at. In many articles that we looked at mentioned balance and imbalance in relationships as a key influence on wellbeing and illness. Hence, we've got it there. And just to sort of, I know it's late in the day and there's probably a lot of information, but one of our team, if you like, in our kahui, Amber Logan's just completed her PhD, and we've taken this this kind of idea from her work, if you like, is that well-being sits along a continuum, and at one end we have mauri noho, or that sort of diminished well-being or stagnancy, as we said there. And at the other end of the continuum, we have mauri ora, which is vitality and energy and so forth. And there are factors that support each of those, and they meet in this muriwai or confluence. And so it's sort of the net outcome of those that produces well-being, or whether it's mauri noho or mauri ora. So there are factors that push towards mauri ora, and also the other way. Ka noho includes those forces that diminish or block wellness, and ka ora the opposite, forces that facilitate or protect wellness. And yes, they meet in this confluence, and it's really the sum of these forces. Wellbeing is the outcome of that. Okay. So going back to my list of 7, the next point that's come out pretty strongly in the literature is that identity is a fundamental component of well-being for Māori, and especially with regard to mental health. And we know that people who feel secure in their identity, especially their cultural identity, are more likely to report a complete sense of well-being. So feeling secure in your cultural identity depends not only on access to your culture and heritage, but also on the opportunity for cultural expression and for your culture to be validated within society's institutions. That's a really important point. So the spaces that we inhabit, we want our culture to be validated, not discriminated against, because that really does affect our well-being significantly. And I linked this point about identity to cultural landscapes, which is a notion many of you will be familiar with, and really I guess it's Roe Hoskins who really developed this idea and promoted it, and now it's more normalised, thanks to him and many other people after who have carried this whakaaro forward. So the idea of cultural landscapes for Māori is that all physical landscapes and the natural environment are inseparable from our atua and our tupuna and important events and practices. And it's also where the past, the present and the future sort of all come together. So these are present in our landscapes. So inherent in this idea of cultural landscapes is that the self is intrinsically linked to the natural world in mind, body and spirit, and through whakapapa, which sees the unique dimensions and features of the landscapes in specific places intimately woven into our identity and our sense of place in our tūranga waiwai. The final point of the 7 is this notion of te ukaipo. And again, this came through in the literature, and it's this idea of a cultural spring or a cultural sanctuary, if you like. It's a place that you can retreat to for cultural nourishment. It's a home where you're not discriminated against, where you can be free to be Māori, and where you can replenish yourself. It's literally a place that feeds our body, mind and spirit. So that's a very important aspect of well-being for Māori, is to have a te ukaipo to go to or be part of. Okay, so this is a graphical representation of our ideas, if you like, formed in this model. All our ideas are there that I've talked about. There are those 7 concepts, and I won't go through them again. And the way it's arranged is around these 3 domains, and starting from sort of the centre, the focus on the whānau, and they're in the domain of te ukaipo. So this is idealised, it's conceptual, okay? It's a starting place, it's a base, if you like. And so whānau are sort of nestled in these, what I'm calling Māori social institutions, marae, kāinga and whenua, and it's where they are safe and are nourished culturally. And so from this basis, if you like, we go out into the world, we engage in the world in these 3 relationship areas, if you like. Te ao tangata, the world of people. So, you know, this is one of those spaces now we're engaging with each other. And there's a 2-way relationship, which has psychological, spiritual, emotional, physical dimensions to it. We also go out into the world and we relate to the physical, to the natural environment and the built environment. So, you know, if you consume anything, you've got a relationship with the environment. If you're producing waste, you've got a relationship with the environment. But those are probably more physical relationship. There are also spiritual and emotional connections with te taiao, of course. And the 3rd relationship area is what we're calling te ao ohanga, and that's the economy, if you like. So we are all, whether we like it or not, connected to the economy in one way or another. And again, that can have a positive or negative effect on our well-being depending on the nature of that relationship. So maybe for some of us, we have a spiritual relationship with the economy. I'm not sure. Maybe those in Treasury might. But we definitely have, you know, physical relationship with the economy. There's transactions, there's trade and exchange. And sort of in the context we're talking about public housing, so sort of bring it back to there, what we're thinking about here is more your local trade and exchange outside the formal, we're talking about the non-monetary economy where, you know, you might volunteer or you might support somebody or your community by doing something or exchanging gifts or whatever it may be. there are lots of elements to the economy. And what we're saying is that they all occur in this domain of whakawhanaungatanga. So we've got to establish and maintain relationships with all of these three areas. And that is surrounded by and sort of infused with the domain of wairuatanga, which permeates all of this. Okay, so we're saying that, yes, the atua and the domain of wairuatanga is present everywhere and at all times. So we have to acknowledge that. So now that's our model, if you like, a sort of graphical representation of it. And as I say, it was developed particularly for the Public Housing and Urban Regeneration research program by our colleagues. But of course, anybody else can use it. But in order to sort of help our colleagues apply it to their various research strands, and as I said, there are 6 other research strands, and they are working with 7 public housing providers. So they're doing quantitative and qualitative research, very in-depth research with tenants and with the providers as well. How do they apply our model to their mahi, if you like? Now that we've answered that question, what is Māori wellbeing? How do we apply it? The way we've done that is to develop questions, and we've got questions under each of the 7 whakaaro that we developed. And I'm not going to go through all 7 of them today, but this is just an example, if you like, around that first point. Relationships are a primary determinant of Māori health. And again, we've divided it into this idea of physical environment and sort of the social environment, if you like. And we've posed these questions, and these are just example questions. There could be many more, and there could be derivative questions from these, but just an example, do Kāinga in urban design and development enable positive relationships with whānau, including with, ngā tangata, te taiao, and te Oranga? That's might not be easy to answer, but you can develop, a sub-question from that. Do Kāinga in urban design address all dimensions of Māori wellbeing, or are they really emphasising just one aspect? Toi Māori, tohu, kupu, te reo included in or on our kāinga and our whare and on the infrastructure, and do they demonstrate relationships with the local environment? Again, this is coming from this idea that relationships are important and they need to be validated out in the world. Are Māori forms and signs visible, used to tell locally relevant stories? So again, it's validation of our culture in public settings, if you like. And our kāinga designed from a multi-generational perspective. On the other side of it, sort of the social constructivism side, sort of looking at the front end, I guess, of development or public housing provision, are kāinga in urban planning, design, development, governance and management informed by the views of mana whenua and mātāwaka? Are they included in there? Because it's necessary to get some of these questions asked at that level there. Are kāinga in urban design and development supported by appropriate cultural practices? Blessing of houses or rahui or whatever it may be, depending on the actual area and the mana whenua and the mātāwaka there. One of the things that the literature actually said to us was, do the tenants know the history of the whare or the kāinga that they're moving into? What's gone on there before? What's happened on this whenua? Do they feel comfortable about staying in this actual whare, if you like? And are place-based stories and pūrākau associated with the location and the neighbourhood and the community available and known to the residents of the community? Again, you could ask a lot of other questions if you wanted. And just going Another example around tikanga. So in terms of the physical environment, the design of that, if you like, or the provision of that, is the use and learning of tikanga supported through the creation of enabling physical environments? It's quite a mouthful, all of that. And, where physical, mental and spiritual connections can occur. Urban form, infrastructure and common areas designed to enable the spiritual and physical relationships mana whenua and other Māori have with the local area? Are there visible signs of kaitiakitanga? And are there accessible areas where food can be produced or mahinga kai are established and protected and enhanced? And on the other side, on the social spaces and cultural spaces, what's normalised, what's discriminated against in those places or not? Do social and cultural environments enable and support the use and learning of tikanga? Is it accepted? Is it normalised? Do social and cultural environments acknowledge and enable and support the cultural practices that reflect the relationships that mana whenua and other Māori have with te whenua, te taio and ngā tupuna? And do mana whenua and other place-based authorities visibly recognise and support relationships that mā tāwaka have with the local environment? So all Māori are included, mana whenua and others from outside the area. So there's a lot of words, and here's some more words for you. This is my closing slide, so I appreciate your attention at this time of day. So to sort of sum up all of that, and these are suggested areas of focus for researchers, public housing providers, for policy makers and others who work in the provision of public housing. I've just posed a whole bunch of other questions related to the ones I've put up before.
I found this on the web.
So are positive relationship building activities with people and the environment and the economy evident and supported? Are all dimensions of well-being addressed and balanced when you go and do your design and your implementation? Is tikanga evident in the Kāinga development processes? And are there opportunities for tikanga to be learned and practiced? Again, we're talking about public housing development. Is wairuatanga evident in the Kāinga development process? And are there opportunities for to normalise and learn and practice Māori spirituality? Now, these are things that support Māori well-being. Is the physical dwelling considered a living entity? Okay, and to be treated with respect because it's saying something to the community it's in. It's not just bricks and mortar, as we've heard. It can be something completely different. It can tell a story, and we're not really using that to support well-being enough, in my opinion. Is a whānau-centric approach to well-being used when designing and managing dwellings and urban spaces occupied by Māori? And are physical and social environments created that explicitly acknowledge mana whenua and mā tāwaka relationships? And finally, are ukaipo identified within the community? And these might be marae, kura, wānanga, other Māori institutions, which I know are under stress already. But again, where are the places that Māori can go to feel culturally recharged, if you like? Are they present in our public housing developments? And that's my last slide. So thank you very much for your attention.
Oh, tēnā koe, Guy. Thank you for your presentation. That was lovely. Does anybody have any pātai or questions they want to ask Guy? Or ka pai.
Tēnā koe, Guy. Tēnā no koe tō kōrero e horihia nei ki mui te aroaro o mātou i te ahiahi nei. Tēnā koe. Just a quick question regarding the, I think 6 or 7, maybe 8 questions you had at the end. And the question is, who decides? Who decides? And how is a decision made as to whether or not all those questions are answered when an urban development and management processes are being applied by the urban developers? So if these are the questions that they're asked to ensure that they're meeting Māori wellbeing needs according to this framework, who decides that they have or haven't, and how?
Well, you're probably best to answer that. Everyone in the room is probably best to answer that, not me. How is it decided now? I mean, through the building code, through the funding, through policy, those sorts of things. So what is the situation now? Who's doing public housing development? They are the ones who are deciding. Obviously.
So you're saying it's basically a self-assessment process. If you were to apply this framework, it would be a self-assessment process that would be applied by the people that are using the framework.
It's a self-assessment, but we're saying to government or our research colleagues or whoever, if you're interested in Māori wellbeing, here's a definition of Māori wellbeing, and these are the sorts of questions you should be asking. So the government should be looking at this. I mean, policymakers should be looking at this to understand possibly why they're not actually achieving Māori wellbeing at the moment.
Tautoko ana i o kōrero me o pātai, engari ko tāku, I guess, depending on who's using it, they can interpret it and decide, yep, we've met that, or nah, we haven't met that, or yeah, we kind of have, or, you know, but that's all I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's right. These are kind of guides. As I said earlier, it's a model, but you could look at it as a framework, or even a map might be a better way to conceive of it. How do we navigate Māori wellbeing? These are some of the elements that can help you achieve Māori wellbeing if you're answering positively, you know, to these questions.
I just have one question. I really enjoyed the concept of a spectrum between Māori noho stagnancy, tito zone of change, and Māori ora. And my question would be, within that framework, is it helpful to consider a baseline of effects within which wellbeing cannot thrive? So is there a baseline of effects such as economic hardship, poverty, racism, in which we could say this will get this?
Yeah, I think. Sorry. Oh. You'll bring it up, see? Oh, sorry. Absolutely. So the model is theoretical, but it's supposed to be populated by, you know, what researchers find, I guess, or what you know. So I'm not prescribing the answer to that. I'm leaving it open. I'm not best placed to answer that. I'm a geographer. I'm a systems person. So that's what I've created. The system that has these elements that support Māori wellbeing. The specifics is what you're asking for. And so that's up to us all to define those things that don't support Māori wellbeing. But it might be around the economy or the economics or the financing, or just as we heard from our Pacific Island colleagues, and the idea that wahine Māori aren't represented. That's producing poor outcomes for Māori women because they're just not represented, and so that's probably one factor. Okay, so yeah, I can't prescribe the answer to that. It's.
But my question was, would the framework of Māori Noho also help?
Absolutely, yeah. Yep. And it can be aligned to this, yes.
One last question. Kia ora, Vivian. Kia ora. Kia ora, Guy. I would like to just bring this into a little bit more focus. The concepts are terrific. Done a lot of work around some of the things that really do need to be looked at seriously. There was a question that was asked at the table over there around who's going to use it and how they're going to use it. I'd just like to put the idea out there that perhaps when something's being done, whether it's from the government, whether it's from private enterprise, that if we're going to be looking at the concepts of whakawhanaungatanga Māori, we ask the people in the community what it is that they relate this to be in, because words can be interpreted differently, and different people with different kaupapa may have a different understanding. So, while this is a beautiful framework, could that framework be used to ask the people within the community what it means to them?
Absolutely. So a lot of the literature was primary research, where they did ask people, what does well-being mean for you? So they weren't always in public housing environments, but they did ask Māori that question. And so our review has covered that part of it. We didn't have the capacity to go and do a full-on study, a qualitative study, if you like, on what that is. So we had to do a literature review, but we've based that, there's an enormous amount of literature coming out on Māori wellbeing now, in very specific places, if you like, or situations. And so we've read all those papers. I think we've read over 40 different papers. And we've distilled that into this. But you're right. As we know, this may be a bit too high level for the people who have needs right now. So it's not necessarily, it's looking into the future. If you're going to develop public housing, and you're going to create policy and activities around public housing, these are some of the things that you should really be considering if you want to achieve better Māori wellbeing outcomes.